So now that we have a broad understanding of the context of common schools, um, we're going to kind of narrow it down and be more specific. So there's four key factors to understand around the common school era: westward migration, immigration, urbanization, and industrialization. So westward migration is it seems very straightforward, but it actually has a lot of relationship to the other three. Um, Westward migration occupies an ideological place in this vision of what it means to be American. And it also is just a very pragmatic geographical expansion during this time period, the 1830s onward. Now, it's important to understand that in 1830, Andrew Jackson, as president, was the first person to really push for Indian removal at a broad federal way. And that basically is what created the possibility for westward migration. So in that sense, territorial expansion and Indian removal obviously go very much hand in hand. The other thing about that is Indian removal and expansion of territory quite often coincided with expansion of slavery. So if you think of it, it's basically an expansion of land. That land then is tilled or cultivated to produce certain crops, and the cheap or exploited labor that's being used to work that land is in the form of slavery, in the South in particular. So there's that relationship there, that cycle. But there's also that ideological imagining of what it means to be American that's very much tied to westward migration. You probably have heard that referred to most often as manifest destiny. The idea that Americans are somehow exceptional or very special, and so they are entitled to these certain things, such as the entire North American continent in this case. And you can see a visioning of this in the picture on the PowerPoint that kind of helps to tie this together with classical liberalism. So in this sense, you can see that manifest destiny is tied to a belief in progress. You can see that from moving from right to left, there is light moving from east to west. In other words, the light is symbolizing civilization, enlightenment, progress. You can see that the train is also here in the middle, moving east to west, symbolizing, again, civilization, progress, enlightenment. She's carrying a telegraph wire in her arm. We see that white settlers down here on the bottom have tools in their hand, they're cultivating the land. All of these are symbols of progress. We can see in the darkness that there are teepees on the plains, there's a herd of buffalo, and so we're symbolizing there a lack of civilization, a lack of enlightenment that is being remedied basically through manifest destiny. So as we had said earlier around natural law, faith and reason, and progress, this is a very ideological way of understanding what it means to be American that can't really be separated from a racial identity and a sense of entitlement. Okay, so then the other question is, well, who are these people who are spreading out on this land? Where are the big population surges coming from? So especially in the early 1800s, there are huge waves of immigration all through the 19th century in the United States. The earliest colonists in the United States were about 70% English and then German, Dutch, but the English really dominated. And that definitely impacted subsequent immigration. The majority of immigrants after that, throughout the 1800s, also were European. There were some Chinese immigrants, especially starting in the 1840s, but the U.S. really wasn't very hospitable to non-European immigration. A big reason why was the 1790 Immigration and Naturalization Act. This act said that you had to be white in order to naturalize as a U.S. citizen. And this is something that stayed on the books for quite a long period of time, in particular for Asian Americans. It wasn't until 1952 that people of Asian descent were able to naturalize as U.S. citizens. So that's only 60 years ago. So that's very important to understand how much these immigration barriers have shaped the demographics of this country, because that constant exclusion. We had a literal exclusion of Chinese in the 1880s, or the metaphorical exclusion by not giving people full citizenship rights, had a huge impact on the population of the United States. So that's important to keep in mind, because when we talk later about labor and workers, and that a lot of the workers were immigrants, one of the things we have to understand is that they may have been operating from a standpoint where they were politically disenfranchised because they hadn't fully been able to access citizenship at that time. So when people don't have the ability to politically advocate for themselves, quite often a collective labor movement is really their only option. So part of that labor movement then is also just a recognition that the industrialized society, just by the nature of how industrialization was structured, created huge gaps in wealth. There are a lot of profits for the people who own the factories, and a lot of exploitation and inadequate wages for people who work there. So there were big gaps, which led to a lot of social instability, because the people on the bottom being exploited were very discontented and were pushing back around this issue. So there's a lot of fear and concern around these class tensions and around the instability of workers in particular. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of what immigration looked like through the 19th century, one of the things we can see is that these trends really coincide with political and economic tensions in the sending country. So for example, we can see big waves of Irish immigration during the same time period as the Great Potato Famine was taking place in Ireland. So the next aspect of the context then, we had westward migration, immigration. Now we're looking at urbanization. So urbanization, immigrants who are working in factories are basically living in cities. They're creating cities because that's where all the workers are being concentrated, around the factories. So the cities weren't necessarily prepared for these large shifts in population, especially shifts in population where people had not received any sort of support and were very financially vulnerable. So what ended up happening is that these urban areas had really big pockets of poverty, of just living in really poor conditions, of just a lot of miserable experiences. So rather than say, the way we've structured industrialization is really exploitative and unequal, and it's creating huge social problems. That's not what reformers and industrialists were saying. What they were saying is these immigrants are dirty, they don't know how to live right, they don't know how to keep a clean house, so we need to teach them a better lifestyle. So they completely ignored the systemic source of the problem, and instead focused on the victim of that problem and said, we need to fix you and get you to better accommodate yourself to this inequality. So there are kind of a couple parts to that. One is this idea of teaching self-governance through socialization. In other words, this idea that you need to learn how to act right, how to discipline yourself, how to defer gratification, how to keep a clean house, and all of this. And that will mean that if you keep doing that, just like the Republican virtue, you will not be poor anymore. You will work your way out of it. The other thing about that is it kind of defaulted again to that Protestant morality. It also helped to try to stabilize these inequalities by teaching poor people to accept inequality, that inequality was proper and just the way the world is, and that the only way to fix it would be to individually acquire more wealth and change your position in that unequal system. And then the last part of this context is industrialization. We've already kind of alluded to it up to this point, but it's basically the shifting of the economy into a manufacturing economy away from an agricultural one. So these manufacturing centers created big booms in population in urban areas. Cities expanded very rapidly. The infrastructure wasn't always ready for it, so they didn't always have the housing or the sanitation or the education. So people are looking to schools to really help fix some of these problems. And that's where Whig reformers like Horace Mann come into play. They're going to teach an industrial morality. In other words, they're going to take people used to an agricultural economy and socialize them into the work habits and dispositions of a manufacturing economy. And that's supposed to make it a lot easier for industrialists to find good workers, to keep those workers, and have a very efficient, stable workplace environment. So some examples of the difficulty of that socialization would be, from an agricultural perspective, you go by the seasons, you go by the weather, you go by your own judgment in terms of what you do, when you do it, and how you do it. Whereas in a factory, you go by the clock and you go by your manager. So you are passive and you receive orders. So from an agricultural perspective, you're using your own judgment and you're governing yourself. So to get someone to accept a more passive, submissive role was not easy. So that's where the schools came into play, where they were teaching people, sit in lines, raise your hand, walk, in an orderly fashion, and so forth. And so through that experience in school, where you're socializing people to submit to authority over and over and over again, you're really creating the disposition in children that they will need later in life as adults in that same economy.